See?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Karen Trivett, and I'm an archivist. And this is another episode of An Archivist Tale, a podcast created by my husband, Geof and me. Hi, Geof.
Hello, Karen. And it's an interesting podcast for a number of reasons.
Indeed.
First, this is our first remote podcast. We are not in the same continent as the guest today.
Exactly.
You see the guest, but we're not going to tell you about her. The other thing is, this is also our first podcast that will have a video component.
Exactly.
So usually I'm looking at Karen, talking to her. She's across the table from me now. I can see her out of the corner of my eye and on the video screen, but nothing else. And also, this is our first podcast to originate, at least in part, from the great country of Ecuador. And so it's going to be an interesting day today, yes, ladies and gentlemen, especially because we are still inside a worldwide pandemic. And the reason we are now remote podcasting, we finally figured out how to do it, is because we need to keep collecting stories. And
Absolutely.
This is the only way to do it right now, because we almost never leave the apartment because we live in New York City. So we live at the epicenter of the coronavirus pandemic at this point in time.
Yes, we are. We are definitely getting a bit stir crazy, cabin feverish, as they say. But we're alleviating some of that fever today with our guest, and I am thrilled to ask her to introduce herself.
Hello, I'm so happy to be with you this long distance. My name is Judy Blankenship. I am in Cañari, Ecuador, a mountain town at 10,000 feet in the Andes. A small town where I have lived, I have known for the past 20 years and have lived here half years since 2005 with my husband, Michael. So I live here 6 months of every year, 6 months in Portland, Oregon.
Thank you so much for being with us, Judy. I'll just dive in and ask you the first question we ask our subjects, which is, tell us, what is your archivist origin story?
Okay, well, I can't see you anymore. You've gone off screen, so I'm going to describe this looking at myself. I am what I call a de facto archivist. And by that, I mean, I didn't start out to be an archivist. I am a documentary photographer with a background in the social sciences and a background in academics. But in about 25 years ago, my son went off to college, and I had gone to art school, prepared for this transition by going to art school and learning documentary photography. And I was already an educator, and I applied to work in Central America as a adult educator and documentary photographer. So my life as a photographer began in Costa Rica in 1985. And my work then was with a Canadian agency called CUSO, which was roughly the equivalent of the Peace Corps. Mm. So from that time on until today, my focus has been on documenting in Costa Rica. I worked documenting a culture in the north of called Guanacaste, which had been part of Nicaragua, then part of Costa Rica, and it was one of the few remnants of an indigenous culture in Costa Rica. After 6 years in Costa Rica, where I met, where I met my husband, by the way, who's from Oregon, who's now sitting out in the patio here of our house. I can see him. Working on his New York Times crossword puzzle.
Well, it's Friday. It's going to be pretty hard.
Yeah.
After 6 years in Central America working with this NGO, I wanted a year's sabbatical just to do a project on my own. And it was a sort of dream that wasn't very realistic, but fortunately I have linked up with a partner who goes along with things like this. I wanted to have a year to document an indigenous village in the Andes of South America. It was sort of that general. Looking at a map, we chose Ecuador. We came here the first time in 1991, and I began that search for an indigenous village where I could be the sort of the photographer of daily life. Mm. So I'm going to stop there and let you ask me a question, Karen, because I don't want to just keep going on.
We'd love to have you go on.
Are you there?
But with that, sorry.
All right. All right, and I will. And then
continuum.
Further. Okay, well, I'll continue on to the point where I found Cañari, and then I'll stop and let you ask a question. So Michael and I settled in the town of Cuenca, and I think many of your listeners or viewers will know that Cuenca is one of the most beautiful colonial cities in South America. Mm. This is pre-internet days, and it's really hard to imagine what it's like now to live before the internet. But we didn't know where there was an indigenous village. We simply would get on a bus one day and ride to the north, the south, out to the mountains all around, and ask if this was an indigenous village. I mean, it sounds really, when I describe this now, it sounds so naive. We finally realized, and we were living in a hotel, and it was really, we brought, 10 bags from suitcases from from Costa Rica. We were uncomfortable, we were crowded, we were fighting. So we finally said, why don't we just stay in this beautiful city of Cuenca for now and see what happens? And so we rented a house, a very nice house. It was different from what I had imagined, which was living in a village maybe without running water or electricity. And we settled into a life in the city of Cuenca, which is very different from what I had imagined. However, through my NGO connections, I volunteered as a photographer and an oral historian for a research project with some social scientists, some Ecuadorian social scientists. And they took me out on the first field day to meet the team that we were working with in the field. And it turned out to be a group of Cañari indigenous people here in Cañar. And this was in about 1992. We had come to Ecuador for 1 year. And at the end of that first year, I had hardly taken a single photograph. Oh, wow. So once we were invited to stay and work with this indigenous organization, we did, because we were both free at that point, and we decided to stay a second year. So that took us to 1993. And we lived in Cuenca for 2 years, but I began to teach 2 young Cañari men photography and oral history skills. Wow. And the project agreement was that once the research ended, this organization in Cañar would be given a camera and 2 recorders. So the project ended after 3 months, but I continued to work with these two young men who were my students, my Cañari students. And that was our entree into a community that is very, at that time particularly, it is very difficult to come in as an outsider into the community, the indigenous community of Cañar, and be able to work, take photos. And these two young men, we became friends with their families, and this was the beginning, the real beginning of my work in Cañar.
Wow.
So, and then it was time for us to leave. So let me just stop there. We're only at 1993, and I'm gonna. And I'm gonna let you ask a question.
Well, the one question, which is going to be of interest to the listeners, the viewers, has to do with how your project operates. It's a community archives project, and it has components to it. So if you could explain that to us, that would.
Yes. This relates to how I've always worked as a documentary photographer and now as an archivist. I always worked in a collaborative method where I only photographed people who were willing to pose for me or invite me to come along, if that could be, to chop down a tree or for a home birth or for a funeral, whatever it was, I had to be invited to come along. And I shared the photographs that I took on these outings with the people who were my collaborators, let's say. Mm-hmm. The archive that I eventually began to build out of my 20 years of documentary photography about 5 years ago is very much the same collaborative method. And I have to say, it's the only way I can work in this community. When I arrived here, the community was very poor. Their only experience with people with cameras were missionaries primarily, or European aid agencies who came in, and as they would say, they always came with cameras, they took photos, or they took, did their thesis research and went away, and we never had anything back. Mm-hmm. And so my policy has also been, because I work with a lot of PhD students and others who want to come and document or do research here, and it's always with the agreement that whatever gets produced here in Cañar has to come back to Cañar, and it has to be a part of the archive. So that's getting to your question, I think, Geof?
Sure does. But so, and what
right.
Or
okay. Let's see let's see. Well, of course, the archive consists of my own photography. So for years, I worked with a medium format camera with my own darkroom, which I still have here. It's right behind me. I'm going to just see that door. That is I did all of my own work, and I produced nothing but black and white photos for, 15 years. Wow. And also slides. And I didn't start working in digital until 2005. So the archive, first of all, before it was even an archive, let's just call it was the Judy Blankenship collection of photos. And I've always been really well organized. So everything is categorized. I know exactly where my negatives are. If someone would ask me for a photograph from 1998 of a particular event, I could have that in 5 minutes, because I kept really careful records, organization, file cabinets. but then something happened in about 6 years ago, and I'm going to show you something of this. And that was, I discovered, and most of my work, actually, I have to say, was with the indigenous communities up until around 2010. I discovered that there was a town photographer who had been working in glass negatives.
Wow.
He died at 90 in 2001.
Really?
So he started working back in the 30s, the 40s. And I discovered this fantastic trove of negatives, actually. And the family agreed, this photographer's name was Navas. The family agreed that I could begin to develop his negatives and scan them in my darkroom and in my studio here. So for years, for about 3 years, I would take a box of negatives from their house, which was just the darkroom. It was just basically a closet had been left when he died, and it was dusty and everything was jumbled together. But very carefully, I would bring a box of negatives home, develop them, take them back, and then take a contact sheet, which is what this is, and give that to the family. Mm-hmm. So this became a part of the art. I mean, that's when I first began to think about, what am I doing here? I'm starting to gather photographs from other sources. This is not just the Judy Blankenship collection of photos. This is something grander, or something greater, I should say, than that. At about the same time, I was introduced to the photographs of some Danish anthropologists who were here in Cañari in the 1970s, and they were in this village called Hunkal. Mm-hmm. And I wrote to these anthropologists in Denmark, and I said, I've seen these photos. You published a book, the museum in Copenhagen published a book. I've seen the photos. Would you be willing to send them to Cañari so that the Cañari people can have access to your works? Mm-hmm. And they wrote back, Eva, the anthropologist of the couple, who's the younger of the two. Niels Falk is now in his 90s, and Eva is younger. She wrote back and she said, we have been wanting this book to be published in Spanish for years, so that the people of Hunkal can have access to it. So if you would coordinate a Spanish publication, we would love to work with you and pay for it and pay for the translation. Mm-hmm. So long story short, Eva Krenner and Niels Falk ended up sending me 800 professionally scanned photos with metadata, 800 photos for the archive. And they are fantastic photos. I'm not sure if you can see from this. I think you do get a sense that Niels he also had a medium format camera. I think he had a Rolleiflex. And he took beautiful photographs through they were two different periods in the 70s. And Eva had kept careful metadata. So we had names, we had dates, we had information on every single photo. Mm. So again, this is going to be an archive. It slowly began. And then the Peace Corps guys found me on the internet because I've published a couple of books. And I was just going to show you, this was the first book I published. When we came back to Cañari in 2000, I had a Fulbright grant, and we came for a full year. And the book is called Cañari, A Year in the Highlands of Ecuador. And it also has quite a few photographs of the type that I was taking then, which are the black and white portraits.
Nice. Right.
And, so this book was published by University of Texas, as is my second book,
Wow.
So in my head, and he got in touch with other Peace Corps workers, and now I have a Peace Corps collection of about 300 photographs. And this then became part of this archive, that I hadn't really set out to create, but it got to seem to me better and better an idea as time went on. And then I just got interested in the search. Who else was here in Cañari? How else? Because there was no visual history of this place. There were no photographs. There were no cameras. The people here were very poor, except for the town photographer who was doing these sorts of portraits. Those exist.
Those are.
But, sorry.
Those are very important. But the other thing is, all that stuff existed, but it didn't have the value it needed because it wasn't in the right place. It wasn't in the place where they would understand it the best and care about it the best and get the most value out of it.
Well, and it's like, to me, Judy, the concept of an archive found you.
That's a good way to put it. Exactly.
How did it gel for you that this needed to be collected, preserved, and made available? How did that concept?
Well, as I said, I've always been really organized. So I kept everything in place, just being a librarian at heart. Let me think a minute here. Let me think a minute. Okay. All right. I got it. I have also a tremendous number of archivally printed black and white photographs from my time working with a large medium format camera and in my own darkroom. And I called the University of Texas in Austin, and this was just, looking online, doing some research. And I saw that the University of Texas in Austin had a Latin American collection at the Benson Library in Austin. And I sent a cold email. Can you call it that? It's like a cold call, a cold email to the guy who was the head of the archive there. And I said, I have this great collection of photographs, and I'd like to start thinking about where they might go permanently. Would you be interested to take a look? And he wrote back and said, well, if you're ever in Austin, come by and talk to us. So I never planned to be in Austin, but my sister does live there part of the year. So I wrote back and said, as it happens, I'm going to come to Austin. And I bring the photographs and show you. So he turned me over to the archivist there, whose name is Christian Kelleher. And I showed up in Austin. I was prepared to give a whole presentation with my actual photographs. This is pre-archive days. This is basically just to see if they wanted my collection of photos. And as a result of that meeting, I mean, they were impressed with my photos, but they just said, let's stay in touch. But Christian got back in touch with me, and he said, I think you would like to meet a friend of mine virtually, and her name is Natalie Bauer. And she is an archivist with the she's working as an archivist in Florida, and she's organizing a part of the conference at the Association of American Archivists this year in Cleveland, I think it was. We're talking 5 years ago. Does this ring a bell?
Yes, we were there.
We were there, yeah.
And Christian said, we're part of something called the Itinerant Archivists, because we want to expand the perspective of the AAA into other countries. And we are wanting to have a session in Cleveland on archivists or archival projects from other countries. Mm-hmm. So I got in touch with Natalie, and Natalie is this young, she's this, this young, yeah. And she was wonderful. I mean, who was I? I wasn't, I was a documentary photographer with all of these odd collections. She immediately sort of slotted me in and said, I think you should give a presentation in Cleveland. And if you can finance your own trip there, you can share the hotel room with me, and we'll put this together. And she was a wonderful sort of workmate, in terms of, because I work remotely all the time, I'm very sensitive to who answers emails, who's good at working back and forth through email, basically. And Natalie was stellar. And so we met in Cleveland. I gave a presentation to the itinerant archivists in a session called, I don't know, International Connections or something. And I came away thinking, I think I'm an archivist.
Wow.
I think you're right.
I'm glad I got to bring Natalie in, because you know her.
Yeah.
And it was such an important part of this process, which I haven't actually told the story before. So I'm really pleased. Thank you.
Right. Well, this is part of our to hear the story of archivists. What kind of? They could just be facto archivists.
Well, great. De facto, yes. Facto or not, huh?
or not. So in Cleveland, because I did not go to that session. Who knows what session I went to? And it's the Society of American Archivists there. So how many people, however, showed up at that session? Thank you for the word.
Yes.
Well,
I mean,
I think
was it a small group or a big group?
It was a small group. Let's say maybe 50 people showed up.
Oh, we call that a big group.
Now is that? Well, the itinerant archivist at that point was Christian Kelleher.
Yeah.
Sorry?
No, it doesn't matter. Christian Kelleher.
The itinerant archivist then was a group of about 10 people, 10 archivists. Mm-hmm. And what came out of that meeting was their desire to come to Ecuador.
Mm. Right.
And Natalie had a connection with Ecuador. She had been married with an Ecuadorian and to an Ecuadorian, and she had connections here. So Natalie and I put together a trip of the itinerant archivists. This would have been about 8 people, I think, the next year. So we must be talking about 2016 or something. I'm not very good at these dates. So that was another thing that just sort of clarified for me what I was doing here. One of Natalie's contacts is Jorge Yepes. And Jorge turned out, he is the only trained archivist in Ecuador. And by that I mean he has a master's from Spain in archival work or archive. I don't know what it's called, but he is. Everyone else are librarians who act as archivists, if you know what I mean. So Jorge was this wonderful guy, enthused. He put together a whole conference in Quito where we all presented. And then we took a trip down to Cuenca, and we met people there, and we came to Cañari, and we did a whole program with the indigenous community here in Cañari, explaining who archivists are, what an archive is. And it was sort of awkward a little bit because we had to use a translator because most of the people didn't speak Spanish. Mm. But for Natalie and I think for the group that came, it was a really, and that included Christian, it was a really important experience for all of us. And it also really solidified my belief that for this to be, well, by then I was included, I think by then I was included in the grant at the University of Texas with the Archive of Indigenous Languages of Latin America, ILA. But I became focused on what are we doing? This archive has to be here in Cañari, where we barely have internet connection. Wow. Most people do not have computers in the home. I'm talking about the indigenous communities. Mm-hmm. And I would say from 2 years ago, then my whole focus has been on how can we somehow set up an archive here in Cañari that won't be internet dependent. Mm. So this has been my whole focus for the past 2 years, I would say 3 years, really. And I'll stop if you want to ask me a question.
Well, the only question is, where is this non-independent, internet-dependent archive?
Yeah, right. Good question. So through my work here over the years, I have a connection with a bilingual educational complex, and this is the first school that the Cañari community began with the agrarian reform, which is in the 70s. So before that, all of Cañari was one huge hacienda owned by the Catholic Church. So that's another story, but part of the agrarian reform, the indigenous communities insisted that they be able to establish their own school that's bilingual, meaning Quechua, Spanish. Mm-hmm. And it's a beautiful school complex that was built in the 70s or the 80s, I guess. And it's sort of now not quite as grand as it was, but it's out in the country. It's up in a community about 3 kilometers from here. And they have a library, which doesn't have many books in it, but it's a big space. And they have a librarian, and they have a computer, a couple of computers. Mm-hmm. So I had a small grant of about $600 3 years ago. And with that grant, we began to build is hardly the word. We began to try to set up a system where anyone in the community, in the indigenous community, could come in and ask to see the photographs from their Fiesta de San Antonio 5 years ago. Mm. And so we basically just set up a database on a computer with all the files that I had from my digital photos, and actually from my non-digital photos mm-hmm. as well. Mm-hmm. But and I have a catalog I wanted to show you, because last year I made this very artisanal catalog, and it's the catalog of the Archivo Cultural de los Cañaris. Mm-hmm. And you can see that there's a title in Quechua below that. And that photograph on the cover there is a Peace Corps photo from the 1960s. And so basically the archive is on a computer, and it, for example, the first category is political actions. And under that are files like the election of the first indigenous mayor in the history of the town, 2019, blocking the Pan American Highway protest, 2010. And below that are activities, agricultural activities, and then a list of animals, plowing, corn, quinoa. So basically, the librarian is the one who would help anyone find a file of photographs, or if they want, there's articles and a few books, but mostly it's photographs and oral histories. But also anyone can bring a flash drive in and take anything away from that. And so one of the ways we were trying to do this is we're saying, come to the library, bring your flash drive, or the librarian will make a CD for you. One of the things I bought here 3 years ago was a whole pack of CDs. And who uses CDs these years? I mean, change. So anyway, this archive will eventually be online at the University of Texas. But the idea is so few people will be able to really access it or know how to access it in Texas that we have to do something here on the ground in Cañari to make this available.
That they have this connection to their tangible history, which got dispersed.
Yes.
Everything you told us about got dispersed. Maybe even you took some of your photographs away. And so if you can bring it back to them, that's something that they need. And the only great negative that had that photographer taking those photographs, which I mean, they look like they're in good shape. They look like they've produced really, really great results, and let people see what their past was like. And I think that's a pretty gift to get.
Yes, in fact, slowly. I mean, I should mention that I'm able to do a lot of this because I don't have to make a living anymore. I mean, I'm okay. Early on, I had several grants, so I've had 3 Fulbright grants for the work that I've been doing over the years, since from 2000 to 2015. But also, I'm of an age that I have Social Security, and I don't have to work to make a living, as so many people here do have to have jobs. So I sort of have the freedom to move around and do some of these projects sort of freely, let's say. So one of the things I wanted to mention is that I'm making a book now that the municipality has agreed to publish, and it's a book of those glass negatives.
Oh, wow.
And so this here is the photographer as a young person.
Wow.
And I'm using a model of another series of books that were produced in Ecuador before the crash. And the agency that produced these books, called the Collection of Photographs of the 20th Century, is out of business. But because I was ready to, I have these photos printed, I'm ready to do all the work around the design of the book. I'm ready to work with the printer. I'm ready to look for someone to write the introduction. We're going to have a result here of this book, well, supposedly this year. I'm not sure what'll happen now. But that was also the way this book happened. So after we published this in Spanish, I proposed to the municipality that we do a version in Quechua. And this book, we just launched this book about a month ago. I'm trying to get the title here for you so you can see it's in Quechua. And this was the result of 3 years of work by some teachers who taught Quechua.
Wow.
And, well, actually, it's easier to see the Quechua title here in the cover. And this book has been, the municipality printed 500 copies of this book in Quechua for us to give out to the schools, to the bilingual schools, and to the bilingual educators. Mm-hmm. So again, a project that just came out of sort of being around, being persistent, and I love organizing things like this. But I have to stress again that I've been here off and on since 1993, and I've been living here every year since 2005. So all of these projects have taken a lot of patience and a lot of just patience, persistence,
and time.
Do you have a question?
I got lots of time now.
Question: how would you measure success of these projects? I'm thinking in terms of like user activity. How do you measure success in that regard?
Yeah, that's a hard one. You know, it really is. Mm-hmm. Because this is, I mean, the indigenous communities have not been a literate community until very recent. So there's not a practice of reading, for example. Mm-hmm.
Which is valuable.
Like, for example, we launched this book in the community about a month ago with maybe 100 or more people from the community there. Mm-hmm. And I have these wonderful photos of them looking at it, but only at the photos. I mean, what people do love, they have beautiful visual literacy, if I could use that term. It's not a reading culture, but it's a visual culture. And even within the town, and it's a small town, you know, so this is actually one of the few town projects I've ever done because everyone knows everyone else, you know. And so we have to be very careful that we're not going to use portraits of individual people. Like we would never use this portrait in this book unless we put a caption on it that said studio portrait or something, you know. Mm-hmm. What I'm saying is there's lots of gossip, there's lots of comparing, there's lots of... So usability, partly it's because I know what people here will relate to, let's say that. The archive in the library at the bilingual school, not very many people use it, to tell you the truth. It's there, and at every chance I have, I make a reference to it, and I try to emphasize it. This is for everyone. It's free. It's open. Just show up, and you can have, you know, any of it. So usability, I'm not quite sure. I think for the future, I think all of these things, I feel, including my own archive, which I'm still trying to get the University of Texas to accept, and they haven't yet. I talked about my physical archive. My digital archive is in, but I guess it's for the future. You know, I think about researchers like Eva and Niels and how almost 50 years later, we are still mining the work that they produced in the 1970s in this small town near here. So, but that's a good question. You got me thinking.
Yeah.
And I mean, I wouldn't worry about people being more interested in visuals. Everybody's more interested in visuals. That's usually what people are drawn to. And the power of visual archives is that you see something in detail that you can't even quite explain. Whereas if you read something, you pretty much usually know what everything means, and you've taken it in except for some cultural references or something. So that's just humans react. You know, we must have good eyes, even though you can't tell from me because I have to wear glasses all the time. But it's sort of And it's kind of interesting that you didn't define it this way, but you explained it in such a way that it was an accidental archive, that it did come up.
Yeah, I love that term too.
You did not originally, you did not conceive of it. It conceived of itself in some way, or fate conceived of it for you, which I think is pretty beautiful story.
Yeah,
I think it's
definitely
a good way for it to run. I should note also, because I told you I was going to say this, it's very interesting because I lived in Quechua speaking part of the world when I lived in La Paz, Bolivia. I was in a suburb called Calacoto, but still, the first time I've seen Quechua written is when you showed me that book. Because I saw plenty of Spanish, and I went to an English language school, so I saw plenty of English, but I never saw, which is interesting because the majority of the population was at least partly Quechua speaking, even though it was big. Well, certainly lots of Spanish, but the people that you saw in the pictures look like the people. It was also above 10,000 feet above sea level.
Yep.
Those are them. The headwear is the same. The clothes they're not identical, but the clothes are the same. It was a very interesting thing because I haven't been to the Andes of Ecuador. I've been to Peru and Bolivia, the Andes in Peru and Bolivia a lot, but it's quite nice to see it. As I said to you in an email, it looks like home.
Yeah. So Judy, I'm curious.
Yeah, and actually the Cañaris today still look like this. I mean, these traditional way of dressing is still very much part of the culture here today.
I'm curious, Judy. Tell us, what was it about Central America and then South America that really spoke to you, that called to you?
I'm changing views here because I'm trying to avoid a glare again on the wall, but also you get to see photos behind me that are from the Peace Corps and other sources. At any rate, I'm so glad you asked that question because it goes back to, I'm laughing because I just don't get asked these questions very often, and it's so much fun to describe. But when I was in, I taught at a SUNY system I mentioned to Karen before, at a new community college in upstate New York.
Which one?
Near Buffalo.
Buffalo.
It was called Genesee Community College.
Oh, okay. That's why I couldn't figure out where it was. Okay, go on. I know it.
Brand new. And I taught sociology and marriage and the family. Little did they know I was newly divorced and from San Francisco. And I had a 9-year-old child with me. So I did not want my son to grow up in this ultra conservative community. So I applied to immigrate to Canada and ended up teaching in a community college, a technical college they were called, in Toronto. And it was the best thing I could have done, both for myself at that point. I was barely in my 30s, I think, and for my son, because Toronto turned out to be, for me, so let me think here. So I would have immigrated to Canada in 1975. So first of all, I had published one book while I was teaching in upstate New York, a sociology textbook. So I had a little bit of publishing experience from that. But I joined a feminist, I was teaching at this college, but I joined a feminist socialist publishing collective called the Women's Press in Toronto in the 1970s. Wow. And I can't begin to sort of describe for me the excitement of sort of becoming a feminist, let's say, more so than becoming a socialist. But that led Toronto in those days was just filled with political activities. There were a lot of Latin American refugees there from Chile. And there was a lot of solidarity work going on with Nicaragua, El Salvador. So for those years, I lived in Toronto for 10 years, and I was involved with the publishing collective during that time. But I also got involved with solidarity work. And when my son was ready to go off to university in New York, by the way, at NYU, I applied to go to work in Nicaragua with a Canadian NGO. Mm-hmm. And at that point, there was all this sort of romanticism around. There were all these handsome Latinos. Everyone was having an affair with a Chilean or with a Chileans. It was also the gay rights movement was just starting. So, there were marches, there was a lot of connection between the solidarity groups. And it was just, and we were publishing books every year, and I was still teaching. I ended up teaching at the University of Toronto. So I had a really nice kind of base job. And during vacations, and they were generous, long, unpaid vacations I got, I went to art school. And I learned documentary photography in the Ontario College of Arts. So I was ready, and I applied to go to Latin America. I was fired up. I must have been 43 at that time. And I wanted to have then another life. I was single, and my son was going off on his own to NYU, and I wanted to start another life. And it was as a photographer that I wanted to start, but because of my years of teaching, I applied to be an adult educator in Central America. And they didn't have jobs in Nicaragua, but they had a regional job in Costa Rica. Regional meaning I was based in Costa Rica, but I worked in Honduras and El Salvador and Nicaragua and Costa Rica. So that began me thinking that I'm a documentary photographer.
Great.
And so if I could just jump to a final anecdote about those years, that is that I met a Salvadoran refugee in Costa Rica, a wonderful woman who had been in prison and had been part of the underground in the war in El Salvador. And her name was Ana Margarita Gastiazoro. And we became close friends, and I did an oral history of her. I have to show you one more visual here because it's just been published as a book. And 25 years later, talk about patience, all these projects.
Wow.
So this book was published in El Salvador last October. And it's called Tell Mother I'm in Paradise, Memoirs of a Political Prisoner, Ana Margarita Gastiazoro. And we have just, when I say we, I have a colleague editing with me on this book who's in London. We've just signed a contract with the University of Alabama Press, and they're going to publish this in English. So thank you. And there's my Southern connection. That's why I wanted to visit Alabama.
Well, Judy, I want to ask you, you've expressed to listeners, but what keeps you passionate about this work you do?
I could live forever. I would. What can I say? I mean, I'm passionate in part because I have a great partner. I mean, living here in this community 6 months every year, it would never happen if I was on my own. So Michael is the cook. Michael is the supporter. Has been my partner. I met him in Costa Rica. I don't know if I mentioned that. he's from Portland, Oregon, and I met him. He was traveling through Costa Rica when I was working there. So I grabbed him, and we've been together since 1985. Nice. So this is a project. I mean, he doesn't do photography. He was a construction guy in Portland. And when we moved back to Portland in the 80s, he went back to work as a house renovator, basically, all those old houses in Portland. And so, I mean, partly I'm passionate because I have this base of security. And I have a partner who also has a sense of adventure and who would say, let's do that. You know, let's go to Ecuador. Let's see what would happen. You know, let's take a year off. And so that, I think also I'm an inveterate recorder of my life. And I never get tired of that. I keep a daily journal that's just for me. I mean, it's boring, but it's everything that happens the day before. It might be, I mentioned before we started recording that these journals then were largely the basis of the books that I then wrote later about our life here. I started doing watercolors a few years ago, and I do a watercolor every day about a sketch in a watercolor about something that has to do with the day. And it happens to be keeping a record of the virus, both in the US and in Ecuador. But on a normal, say, day, I would be making watercolors such as these of the people around. And so this book actually here is number 50. So and I started this one I do this whether I'm here or in Ecuador. So I started this in Portland, and I do about 2 a year. And they're also photographs. So there's sketches, watercolors plus photographs. That's our house there. So it's a compulsion. Yeah. You know, my grandmother wrote letters to my mother every week. I wrote letters to my mother every week until she died. It comes as it's part of what's in the blood. But also there's a community here that is like, that's the other base that I have, and that is the Cañari community. And the fact that this is where we've lived. We don't live in the town. We don't live too far in the country so that it feels like we're private. We live in a place in between, and we're part of a small community called Chaglaban, which is largely an indigenous community. But we're a 10-minute walk from town. We live here without a car. So that means we walk everywhere. And I think that's been one of the most important things for us to be a part of both the town community and the indigenous community is that we walk, you know. And one other thing I should mention before we close, and that is when Anna died, hold on just a minute. I want to show you one more thing. When Anna died, Anna Margarita, the Salvadoran friend, died young of breast cancer when we were living in Cuenca that first time. She was 40. And I established a women's fund in her name at that time. And years later, this has become a scholarship program for Cañari women. And what I'm holding up there is showing you the photographs of the Cañari women who have gone to university under the scholarship fund. It's an NGO now. I mean, it's a nonprofit in the United States and also here. And I send a letter every year about the scholarship program. And we have it's strictly supported by contacts, friends, family, people who visit us here, very occasionally a small family foundation. But we have 23 women have graduated from university with this program.
Amazing.
And Cañari women. And you'll be getting the letter. You'll be getting the letter this year now that you're. And we have 13 women studying right now. So we pay them a monthly stipend for 5 years, and we've had almost 100% graduation.
That is so impressive.
So this is also a part of being, you know, it's part of being part of the life here. So
sounds great. Thank you. You know, from up in the mountains, not everybody knows the Andes, so I'm glad we have two people here who do.
Yes. And I want to say very quickly, I meant to note, and I did not do that, so I'll note what time we're finishing, which is 4:10, and we've been at this for an hour and 27 seconds, and it's been delightful.
Oh, well.
Yeah. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much. I've loved the opportunity of telling these stories and meeting you too. And thank you for reconnecting. After a couple of years, we've reconnected, and it's been great.
Things until we're ready to do them. So yes. I might come back after 5 years. You never know. But guess what? This we end the video this way too. So, ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of another episode of An Archivist Tale, and God willing, we will find somebody else, some in the world. It could be any place in the world. It could be Antarctica for next week's episode, because we're strangely, because of the pandemic, a little low on episodes now. But lovely to have you, Judy. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.